The moonlight revealed her face streaked with tears as she sat on that rough wooden crate behind the boarding house, her needle moving through fabric with trembling fingers that had clearly done this work 1,000 times before. Winston Jenkins had been tracking elk through the high country outside Bisbee, Arizona territory for 3 weeks straight when he finally decided civilization might do him some good, even if just for a night or two. The year was 1883, and the copper mining town tucked into the Mule Mountains had grown considerably since his last visit 2 years prior. He had not expected to find anything remarkable in Bisbee that September evening, certainly not the woman who would change everything he thought he knew about his solitary life. He stood in the shadows between buildings, his massive frame concealed by darkness, watching her work. Winston was not the type of man to spy on women, but something about the scene held him transfixed. She could not have been more than 22 or 23 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had come partially undone throughout what must have been a long day. Her dress was simple, worn in places, and she was mending what looked like men's work shirts by the inadequate light of a half-moon. The logical thing would have been to announce himself, but Winston remained still, observing. His years in the mountains had taught him patience, had taught him to watch and understand before acting. What he saw troubled him. The young woman's hands shook not just from cold, though the September nights in the high desert could turn bitter, but from what looked like exhaustion or perhaps fear. She kept glancing toward the back door of the boarding house, as though expecting someone to emerge and catch her at her work. Winston finally cleared his throat gently, not wanting to startle her too badly, but knowing his presence needed to be announced. She jumped anyway, dropping the shirt she had been working on, her hand flying to her chest. "I did not mean to frighten you, miss," Winston said, keeping his voice low and steady. He stepped slightly into the moonlight so she could see him better, though he knew his appearance might be alarming in its own right. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broadened by years of swinging an axe and hauling trap lines through mountain snow. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was full though neatly trimmed. Buckskin clothing covered his muscular frame, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had survived alone in country that killed the unprepared. "You should not be sneaking up on people," she said, her voice steadier than he had expected given her evident fright. She bent to retrieve the fallen shirt, but he noticed she positioned herself slightly away from him, ready to bolt if needed. "You are right, and I apologize," Winston said, remaining where he stood. "I came into town for supplies and was heading to the livery when I saw you working out here. Seemed like you could use better light." "The moonlight is free," she replied, her chin lifting slightly in defiance of what might have been pity in his tone. "Not everything worth doing requires payment." Winston considered this, appreciating the spirit in her response. "That is true enough. But moonlight does not make the work easier on the eyes. I will be at the general store in the morning. If I were to purchase some candles and leave them by this crate, would you consider that charity or simple neighborly kindness?" She studied him in the dim light, and Winston held still, letting her look her fill. He knew what she saw, a mountain man, rough and wild-looking, but he hoped she also saw something in his eyes that told her he meant no harm. "I do not know you," she finally said. "Winston Jenkins. I trap and hunt in the high country, come down to Bisbee maybe once or twice a year for supplies." "Katherine Vaughn," she said after a moment's hesitation. "I work at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson owns it. Taking in Mending for extra money." Winston asked, though he suspected there was more to the story. Catherine's expression tightened. "Something like that. I should get back to work. The shirts need to be ready by morning." Winston nodded slowly. "Then I will bid you good night, Miss Vaughn. Perhaps I will see you around town." He walked away, but the image of her sitting there in inadequate light, her hands trembling as they worked, stayed with him as he made his way to the small hotel where he sometimes took a room. Winston had spent the better part of 15 years in the mountains, ever since he was 18 years old, and decided that civilization held nothing for him but disappointment and noise. He preferred the company of pine trees and mountain streams to people. Yet something about Katherine Vaughn had stirred something in him that he thought had died long ago, or perhaps had never existed at all. The next morning, Winston made his way to the general store as soon as it opened. The proprietor, a thin man named Hoskins who had been running the place for as long as Winston could remember, greeted him with the usual mixture of wariness and commercial friendliness that mountain men typically received in town. "Winston Jenkins, as I live and breathe," Hoskins said. "Thought maybe a bear had finally gotten you." "Bears know better," Winston replied with the hint of a smile. "I need supplies. The usual staples plus a dozen good candles, the kind that burn clean and bright." Hoskins raised an eyebrow at the candle request, but said nothing as he began gathering items. Winston added coffee, flour, salt, dried beans, and various other necessities to his order. He also purchased a small tin of tea, though he rarely drank it himself, and some peppermint sticks for reasons he did not examine too closely. With his supplies packed in his saddlebags, except for a bundle of 6 candles wrapped in brown paper, Winston made his way back toward the boarding house. It was mid-morning, and he suspected Katherine would be working inside at this hour. He found the crate where she had been sitting the night before and placed the candles on it, weighing down the paper with a smooth river stone he found nearby. He was turning to leave when the back door opened and Katherine emerged with a basket of wet laundry. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes moving from his face to the package on the crate. "I told myself if you really did it, I would have to thank you properly," she said, setting down the basket. "I thought you were just being kind with words, the way people are sometimes." "I meant what I said," Winston replied. "No one should have to strain their eyes doing fine work in the dark." Katherine walked over to the crate and carefully unwrapped the candles. Her expression softened in a way that made Winston's chest feel strangely tight. "These are good quality. This must have cost you considerably." "I do well enough with my trapping, and I have little enough to spend money on in the mountains." She looked at him for a long moment, and Winston found himself noticing details he had missed in the moonlight. Her eyes were a deep brown, almost black in certain lights, and there was a small scar on her left cheek that looked old, nearly faded to invisibility. She was lovely in an understated way, the kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly rather than announcing itself immediately. "Why?" she asked simply. Winston considered several answers before settling on the truth. "Because I did not like seeing you struggle alone in the dark." "You do not even know me." "No," he agreed, "but I know what it is to work hard with inadequate resources, and I know that sometimes a small kindness can make a considerable difference." A woman's sharp voice called from inside the boarding house. "Katherine, where have you gotten to?" "These floors will not scrub themselves." Katherine's expression tightened, and she quickly rewrapped the candles. "I have to go. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, truly." She hurried inside before Winston could respond, leaving him standing in the yard with more questions than answers. He made his way back to the hotel, but his thoughts kept returning to Katherine Vaughn and the fear that had flashed across her face when that voice called her name. Winston spent the day seeing to various business around town, selling some beaver pelts and a mountain lion hide he had brought with him, purchasing a few items he had forgotten that morning, and getting his horse reshod at the blacksmith. But as evening approached, he found himself walking back toward the boarding house, telling himself he was simply curious whether Katherine would use the candles. The sun had set, and twilight was deepening into night when he spotted her emerging from the back door, the bundle of candles tucked under her arm along with what looked like another armload of mending. She settled onto the crate, and Winston watched from the same shadows as the night before as she carefully arranged 3 of the candles around her workspace, lighting them with matches that she handled as though they were precious. The difference was remarkable. With proper light, Katherine's hands moved more surely through the work, and Winston could see her shoulders gradually relax as she worked. He stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, simply watching, before he made a decision that surprised him. He walked forward into the circle of candlelight and sat down on the ground beside the crate, his back against the wall of the boarding house, saying nothing. Katherine gasped softly when she noticed him. "Mr. Jenkins, you startled me again. I apologize. I saw you had lit the candles and thought you might appreciate some company, but I will not disturb your work with talking if you prefer quiet." She studied him with an expression he could not quite read. "You want to sit here in silence while I mend shirts, if you do not mind. I have been alone in the mountains for weeks. Sometimes it is nice to be near another person without the obligation of conversation." Katherine's expression softened, and she nodded slowly. "I understand that more than you might think. You may stay if you wish, Mr. Jenkins." "Winston," he said. "Mr. Jenkins sounds like my father, and he was not a man I care to be reminded of." "Then you may call me Katherine, or Kate, which is what my mother called me before she passed." Winston settled more comfortably against the wall, stretching his long legs out before him and resting his hands on his thighs. The night air was cool but not unpleasant, and the sounds of Bisbee settling in for the evening drifted over them. Distant laughter from a saloon, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the clop of horse hooves on packed earth. They sat in companionable silence for perhaps 20 minutes, Katherine's needle moving rhythmically through fabric while Winston simply rested, his eyes half closed. It was Katherine who finally spoke. "You really prefer the mountains to civilization?" "Yes," Winston said simply. "Though I suppose it depends on what you mean by civilization. If you mean buildings and crowds and noise, then absolutely. If you mean the company of good people and meaningful connection, then no. I would not turn away from that if I found it. But you have not found it." "Not until now," Winston said, the words emerging before he had fully thought them through. He saw Katherine's hands still for just a moment before resuming their work. "You have known me for 1 day," she said softly. "True enough. But I have known enough people in my life to recognize someone worth knowing better." Katherine set down her mending and looked at him directly. "I am not in a position to encourage the attentions of a man, Winston. My circumstances are complicated." "I gathered that. Mrs. Henderson does not sound like an easy woman to work for," Katherine laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mrs. Henderson is the least of my problems. I owe her money, you see. My father died 2 years ago and left debts that I inherited along with nothing else. Mrs. Henderson paid them in exchange for my service. I work at the boarding house for no wages, only room and board, until the debt is settled. At the rate we agreed upon, I have another 3 years of service remaining." Winston felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and sharp. "That is not legal service. That is indentured servitude, and it has not been legal in the territories for a good long while." "Perhaps not legally, but try explaining that to a judge when you have no money for a lawyer and Mrs. Henderson has half the town council in her pocket. She takes in laundry and mending from half the businesses in Bisbee and pays me nothing for the work. Says it is all going toward my debt, but the numbers never seem to go down no matter how much I do. How much is the debt, originally? $300. But with interest and various fees she has added, she now claims I owe nearly $500. Winston was quiet for a moment, his mind working. And you have no family who could help you. My mother died when I was 16. My father passed 2 years later. I have no siblings, no aunts or uncles who claim me. I am alone in this world except for Mrs. Henderson's generous employment, or so she reminds me daily. The bitterness in Katherine's voice cut at Winston. He understood loneliness, but his was chosen. Hers had been forced upon her by circumstance, and the cruelty of a woman who saw an opportunity to exploit a young person with no protection. What would you do if you were free of this debt? Winston asked. Katherine picked up her mending again, but her movements were slower now, thoughtful. I used to dream of opening a small dress shop. I am skilled with a needle, and I have ideas for designs that I think women would like. But that is a foolish dream requiring capital I will never have. More realistically, I suppose I would try to find work in one of the larger towns, maybe Tucson or Phoenix, somewhere I could earn actual wages and build some kind of life. Not marriage. I will not marry for survival, Katherine said firmly. I have seen too many women trapped in marriages as confining as any debt bondage. If I ever marry, it will be because I found someone who sees me as a partner and an equal, not a convenience or a servant. And given my circumstances, I do not imagine that day will come anytime soon. Winston respected her answer, even as part of him felt the challenge in it. He was not a man given to impulsive decisions, but something about Katherine called to him in a way nothing else had in all his years. She had strength in her, a core of steel wrapped in softness, and she refused to let her circumstances break her spirit. That was worth more than gold in his estimation. They fell back into silence, but it was a comfortable one now, the kind that exists between people who have shared something true with each other. Winston sat beside her for another hour, watching her hands move through the mending by candlelight, occasionally glancing up at the stars that wheeled overhead in their endless patterns. When Katherine finally set aside the last shirt with a sigh of completion, Winston rose smoothly to his feet and offered her his hand. She looked at it for a moment before placing her smaller, work-roughened hand in his. He drew her up gently, conscious of the great difference in their sizes and strength. "Will you be here tomorrow night?" he asked. "Mrs. Henderson will have more mending for me by then. She always does." "Then perhaps I will bring more candles and sit with you again if you would welcome the company." Katherine smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "I would welcome it very much. Good night, Winston." "Good night, Kate." He waited until she had gathered the candles and mending and gone inside before he walked away, his mind already working on plans he had not considered before coming to Bisbee. The next morning, Winston paid a visit to the office of the town's lawyer, a man named Garrett Sanders, who had a reputation for honesty that was rare in frontier legal circles. Sanders listened carefully as Winston explained Katherine's situation, asking pointed questions and making notes on a piece of paper with a careful hand. "Debt bondage of this nature is problematic legally," Sanders said when Winston finished. "But you are right that Mrs. Henderson has connections that would make pursuing this officially difficult for Miss Vaughn. However, there are other approaches we might consider, such as, if the debt were simply paid, Mrs. Henderson would have no legal claim on Miss Vaughn's service. The young woman would be free to seek employment elsewhere or to leave town entirely if she chose. And the cost of such a payment, Sanders leaned back in his chair. I would need to review the original debt agreement, but assuming Mrs. Henderson has not engaged in obvious fraud, which would be difficult to prove in any case. We would be looking at the amount she claims is owed. You said roughly $500. Winston nodded. $500 was a considerable sum, but he had done well in recent years. Beaver pelts commanded good prices when the fur was prime, and he had been careful with his money, having few expenses in the mountains. He had nearly $800 in an account at the bank, money he had been saving for no particular purpose beyond general security. If I were to pay this debt, how would we ensure that Mrs. Henderson could not simply claim Katherine still owed her something else? Sanders smiled slightly. I would draw up a document that, when signed by both parties, would confirm that all debts between them were settled in full and that no further claims could be made. It is a standard release of obligation. Mrs. Henderson would have to sign it to receive the money. And if she refuses, then she would be admitting that no legitimate debt exists, which would support Miss Vaughn's case should she choose to simply leave the woman's employment. It puts Mrs. Henderson in a difficult position legally. She either accepts the payment and loses her source of free labor, or she refuses and reveals that the debt arrangement was never legitimate to begin with. Winston considered this. How long would it take you to draw up such a document? I could have it ready by this afternoon. But Mr. Jenkins, I should ask, what is your interest in Miss Vaughn? I do not mean to pry into personal affairs, but if you are hoping to replace one form of bondage with another, I cannot in good conscience assist you. Katherine will be free to make her own choices, Winston said firmly. What she does with that freedom is entirely her decision. I simply do not like seeing people trapped when I have the means to help them. Sanders studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. Come back at 3 o'clock and I will have the documents ready. Winston spent the rest of the morning at the bank, arranging for the transfer of $500 into an account Sanders could draw from. The banker, a portly man named Simmons, raised his eyebrows at the amount but asked no questions beyond the necessary business ones. By 3 o'clock, Winston was back in Sanders' office, reviewing the legal documents the lawyer had prepared. This releases Katherine Vaughn from all debts and obligations to Millicent Henderson, Sanders explained, pointing to the relevant passages. Once both parties sign and the money is transferred, Miss Vaughn will be free of any legal tie to Mrs. Henderson. I have also included a clause preventing Mrs. Henderson from making disparaging statements about Miss Vaughn's character or work, which should help if the young woman seeks employment elsewhere in town. Good. When can we present this to Mrs. Henderson? I can call on her this evening if you wish. It might be better if you were not present for the initial conversation. Mrs. Henderson is a shrewd woman and will suspect your involvement regardless, but there is no need to confirm it immediately. Winston agreed to this approach, though part of him wanted to be there to see Katherine's face when she learned she was free. But Sanders was right. It would be better to handle this through proper legal channels, without the complication of Winston's physical presence. That evening, Winston made his way to the boarding house as the sun was setting. He found Katherine already outside on her crate, arranging candles around her workspace. She looked up as he approached, and her smile of greeting made something warm unfold in his chest. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." Winston settled into his now familiar spot on the ground beside her crate. "How was your day, Long?" Mrs. Henderson was in a particularly foul mood. One of the boarders left without paying his full rent, and she spent most of the afternoon ranting about the untrustworthiness of miners and drifters. Katherine picked up a shirt and began working on a torn seam. "How was yours? Productive?" "I saw to some business matters and did some thinking about the future." "That sounds ominous," Katherine said lightly, but Winston heard the curiosity in her voice. Not ominous, just different than what I expected when I came to town. They fell into their comfortable silence, and Winston found himself studying Katherine's profile in the candlelight. She had a strong nose and a determined chin, features that might not have been considered classically beautiful, but that came together in a way he found increasingly appealing. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency through the mending, and he noticed that she occasionally flexed her fingers as though they ached. "How long have you been doing such fine needlework?" he asked. "My mother taught me when I was young." She made beautiful dresses before arthritis twisted her hands too badly to work. I was perhaps 14 when I took over most of the sewing for her customers. After she died, I kept on with it, and when my father passed, it was the only skill I had that could earn money. Katherine glanced at him. "What about you? How did you end up in the mountains?" Winston was quiet for a moment, organizing thoughts he rarely shared. "My father was a harsh man who believed children existed to serve their parents' needs. My mother died when I was young, and he remarried a woman who was worse than he was. When I was 18, he told me I would marry the daughter of a man he owed money to as a way of settling the debt. I left that night and never went back." "So we have that in common," Katherine said softly. "Being treated as currency to settle debts. It would seem so. Though I had the advantage of being a young man with the physical strength to strike out on my own. It is harder for women. Do you regret leaving?" "Not for a single moment. The mountains taught me more about being a man than my father ever did. I learned to rely on myself, to read the land and the weather, to understand animals and how to live among them without destroying them. I learned that being alone is not the same as being lonely, though I confess the line between the two has felt thinner in recent years." "Do you ever think about settling in a town?" Winston considered this. "I used to think I never would. The mountains felt like the only place where I could truly breathe. But lately, I have wondered if perhaps what I needed was not isolation from all people, just from the wrong people. Finding the right person might change things considerably." He felt Katherine's eyes on him but did not turn to meet them, letting his words stand without elaboration. They continued in silence for a while longer, and Winston noticed that Katherine seemed more relaxed tonight, her shoulders not as tight with tension. They had been sitting together for perhaps an hour when the back door of the boarding house opened and Mrs. Henderson emerged, followed by Garrett Sanders. Winston rose smoothly to his feet, and Katherine looked up with confusion that quickly turned to alarm. "What is going on?" she asked, standing and moving slightly behind Winston without seeming to realize she had done so. Mrs. Henderson was a thin woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was pinched with displeasure as she looked from Sanders to Winston to Katherine. "It seems you have made an influential friend, girl. Mr. Sanders here has come with a legal proposition that is, unfortunately for me, binding." Sanders stepped forward, his expression professional but not unkind. "Miss Vaughn, a benefactor has chosen to settle your debt to Mrs. Henderson in full. I have here a release of obligation that we need you to sign, acknowledging that all debts between you and Mrs. Henderson are paid and that you are free to seek employment elsewhere should you choose." Katherine looked stunned. Her eyes moved to Winston, wide with shock and something else he could not quite identify. "A benefactor? Winston, did you do this?" "Your debts should not be a lifetime sentence," Winston said simply. "You deserve the chance to make your own choices about your life. But $500. That is a fortune. How can I ever repay you?" "There is no debt between us, Kate. This is a gift freely given with no expectation of repayment or obligation." Mrs. Henderson made a disgusted sound. "How noble! And what do you expect to get in return, Mr. Jenkins? A girl's gratitude can take many forms, I suppose. Winston turned to face Mrs. Henderson, and something in his expression made the woman take an involuntary step backward. You will not speak about Katherine that way. She is free of your exploitation now, and I suggest you take the settlement Mr. Sanders is offering and count yourself fortunate that we are not pursuing legal action for debt bondage. Mrs. Henderson pressed her lips into a thin line but said nothing further. Sanders produced the documents and a pen, and after a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Henderson signed with sharp, angry strokes. Sanders then turned to Katherine, who still looked dazed. Miss Vaughn, if you will sign here, acknowledging receipt of this release and confirming that you understand you are free of all obligations to Mrs. Henderson. Katherine took the pen with trembling hands and signed. Winston watched the emotions play across her face: shock, relief, confusion, and something that looked like the beginning of joy. When she finished signing, Sanders took the documents and handed one copy to Mrs. Henderson and one to Katherine. Your personal belongings, Miss Vaughn. Sanders prompted. I have very little, just some clothes and a few items that belong to my mother. They are in my room. Then I suggest you gather them now, Sanders said. Mrs. Henderson cannot prevent you from leaving with your own property, and it would be best to make a clean break this evening. Katherine nodded and hurried inside. Mrs. Henderson turned to follow her, but Winston stepped smoothly into her path. I will accompany Katherine to ensure her belongings are all accounted for, he said. You may wait here with Mr. Sanders. The older woman looked as though she wanted to argue, but something in Winston's stance discouraged her. He followed Katherine inside and up the narrow stairs to a small room at the end of the hallway. It was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small dresser, with a single window that looked out over the alley. Katherine pulled a worn carpetbag from under the bed and began packing quickly, her movements efficient despite the tears that had started streaming down her face. Winston stood in the doorway, keeping watch, giving her what privacy he could in the cramped space. I do not understand why you did this, Katherine said, her voice thick with emotion as she folded a dress and tucked it into the bag. You do not know me. We have only spoken twice. Sometimes you know important things right away, Winston said. I know you are strong and brave. I know you work hard and do not complain. I know you have principles and dreams. That is enough for me to know you deserved help, and I had the means to give it. Katherine closed the carpetbag and picked up a small wooden box from the dresser. These were my mother's. A few pieces of jewelry, nothing valuable except to me. She turned to face him fully. What happens now? Now you make your own choices. You can stay in Bisbee and find proper employment. You can travel to another town and start fresh. You can pursue your dream of opening a dress shop. You decide, Kate. Your life is your own now. And what about you? Are you staying in town? Winston had been considering this question himself. That depends partly on you. I came to Bisbee for supplies and intended to head back to my cabin in a few days. But if you wanted company while you figured out your next steps, I would be willing to extend my stay. Katherine studied him, and Winston bore her scrutiny patiently. Finally, she spoke. I would like that. I would like that very much. But Winston, I need to be clear about something. I am grateful beyond words for what you have done, but I will not be obligated to you in any way. I meant what I said about not trading one form of servitude for another. I would never ask that of you, Winston said firmly. Your choices are your own, Kate. I make no claims on you. She nodded and wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. Then yes, I would welcome your company while I determine what comes next. I find that I have gotten rather used to our evening conversations. Winston felt a smile tug at his mouth. As have I. Now, let us get you out of this house and somewhere more suitable." They returned downstairs to find Mrs. Henderson and Sanders waiting in tense silence. Katherine walked past Mrs. Henderson without a word, her chin held high, and Winston followed with her bag. Once outside, Sanders shook Winston's hand. "A good night's work, Mr. Jenkins. Miss Vaughn, if you need assistance with anything of a legal nature going forward, please do not hesitate to call on me. The first consultation is free of charge." "Thank you, Mr. Sanders," Katherine said. "For everything." The lawyer departed, and Winston turned to Katherine. "I have a room at the hotel. It is not fancy, but it is clean. I can secure you a room there for tonight, and tomorrow we can determine more permanent arrangements." Katherine looked at the carpetbag in Winston's hand and the small box she held. "Everything I own in the world can be carried in one trip. It seems both liberating and rather sad. You can acquire more things if you wish them, or you can travel light and free. Both have their merits." They walked together through the evening streets of Bisbee toward the hotel. Winston was acutely aware of the stares they attracted, a rough mountain man and a young woman of uncertain status walking together. He knew the gossip would start immediately, but he found he did not care. Let people talk. Kate was free, and that was what mattered. The hotel clerk, a young man with spectacles and an eager manner, secured Katherine a room next to Winston's without comment beyond professional courtesy. Winston carried her bag up the stairs and waited while she unlocked her door and looked inside the small but clean room. "It has a real bed," she said with wonder, "with a mattress that is not lumpy and sheets that are actually clean. I had forgotten what that was like." "Rest tonight," Winston said. "Tomorrow we can talk about your plans." Katherine set down the box and turned to face him. "Winston, I need to say this before I lose my nerve. What you did today was the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. You gave me back my life when you had no reason to do so except basic human decency. I will never forget that, and I will never be able to thank you enough." "You just did," Winston said quietly. "Good night, Kate. If you need anything, I am in the next room." He left before she could say anything else, retreating to his own room where he sat on the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of what he had just done. In the space of 2 days, he had spent a significant portion of his savings to free a woman he barely knew, appended his plans to return to the mountains, and felt more alive than he had in years. The logical part of his mind suggested he was being a fool, that Katherine would probably leave Bisbee as soon as she was able, and he would never see her again. But a deeper, more instinctive part of him knew that what he had done was right, that Katherine Vaughn was going to be important to his life in ways he could not yet fully understand. He lay back on the bed, still fully clothed, and listened to the faint sounds of movement from the room next door. Eventually, the noises stopped, and Winston imagined Katherine finally sleeping without the weight of debt and obligation hanging over her. That alone made the money worthwhile. The next morning, Winston woke early as was his habit and made his way downstairs. He arranged for breakfast to be sent to Katherine's room, then went out to check on his horse at the livery and give himself time to think. The big roan gelding was content in his stall, munching hay and flicking his ears at Winston's approach. "What do you think, Ranger?" Winston asked the horse, stroking his neck. "Did I do the right thing?" Ranger snorted and went back to eating, which Winston chose to interpret as approval. He spent some time checking the horse's hooves and making sure his tack was in good repair, then wandered back toward the hotel as the town began to wake around him. Katherine was sitting in the hotel's small dining room when he returned, a cup of coffee before her and a thoughtful expression on her face. She had changed into a different dress, still worn but clean, and had rebraided her hair. She looked rested and somehow younger than she had the night before. "Good morning," Winston said, taking the seat across from her. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in 2 years," Katherine admitted. "I kept waking up thinking it was all a dream and I would find myself back in that tiny room at the boarding house." A waitress brought Winston coffee and took their breakfast orders. When she left, Katherine leaned forward slightly. "I have been thinking about what I want to do. I have some ideas, but I wanted to discuss them with you first." "You do not need my permission for anything, Kate. I know. But you have invested considerably in my freedom, and I respect your opinion. Also, some of my ideas involve you, so your input would be valuable." Winston sipped his coffee and waited for her to continue. "I do not want to stay in Bisbee," Katherine said firmly. "This town holds nothing but bad memories, and Mrs. Henderson's influence is too pervasive. I would never feel truly free here. I think I should go to a larger city, maybe Tucson or Phoenix, where I can find work and save money toward eventually opening my shop." Winston nodded, ignoring the disappointment that settled in his chest. "That makes sense. Both cities would offer more opportunities. But I do not know either place," Katherine continued, "and I would be arriving as a woman alone with no connections and very little money." "That is dangerous in its own way." "It can be," Winston agreed carefully. "So I thought perhaps you might travel with me, at least as far as Tucson. Make sure I arrive safely and have secured lodging and perhaps employment before you return to your mountains. I know it is an imposition, but I would feel much safer with your protection on the journey." Relief washed through Winston. "That is no imposition at all. I would be honored to see you safely to Tucson." Katherine smiled. "Thank you. I was hoping you would say that. But there is something else I wanted to suggest, and I need you to understand I am not saying this out of obligation or because I feel I owe you anything." Winston raised an eyebrow, curious. "You mentioned that the line between being alone and being lonely has felt thinner in recent years. And I have spent 2 years in crushing loneliness, despite being surrounded by people constantly. What I am trying to say is that I enjoy your company, Winston. You are kind and respectful, and you listen when I talk. When I think about my future, I find that I would like you to be part of it, if you were open to that possibility." Winston set down his coffee cup carefully, his heart beating faster than usual. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that perhaps we might court properly. Take time to know each other better. See if this connection we both seem to feel is real and lasting. I do not know what the future holds, but I would like to explore it with you rather than alone." "Kate, I would like nothing better," Winston said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I need to be honest with you about what that would mean. I am a mountain man. My home is a cabin in the high country, days from the nearest town. I have survived out there for 15 years, and it is not an easy life. There are hardships and dangers that town living does not prepare people for." "Are you saying I would not be suited to such a life?" "I am saying it would be different than anything you have known. Harder in some ways, though I would do everything in my power to make it comfortable. But you have dreams of a dress shop, of building a business in a city. I would not ask you to give that up for me." Katherine was quiet for a moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "What if we approach this differently? What if I went to Tucson and worked for a few months, saved some money, and learned whether I truly wanted the dress shop or if that was just a dream I clung to because it represented freedom? And you could visit when you came to town for supplies. We could write letters in between. And if, after some time has passed, we still feel this way about each other, we could make more permanent plans." "That seems like a wise approach," Winston said, though part of him rebelled at the idea of being separated from her even for a few months. "Though I should warn you, I am not much of a letter writer. Then you will learn. I am told it is good for the soul to put thoughts into words. Catherine's expression turned more serious. Winston, I need you to understand something. I am deeply attracted to you, both to your character and to you as a man. But I have been under someone else's control for 2 years. I need time to discover who I am when I am truly free before I can commit myself to anyone, even someone as good as you. I understand that, Winston said, and he did. Take whatever time you need, Kate. I am not going anywhere. Their breakfast arrived and they ate while discussing the practicalities of travel to Tucson. Winston estimated it would take them 4 or 5 days by horse if they traveled at a reasonable pace. Katherine admitted she had limited experience with riding, which meant they would need to travel even more slowly and carefully. I will need to purchase some suitable clothing for travel, Katherine said. What I have is adequate for town living but not for days in the saddle. We can see to that this morning, and you will need your own horse unless you prefer to ride double with me on Ranger. Katherine blushed slightly at the suggestion, which Winston found endearing. I think my own horse would be more appropriate, at least until we know each other better. They spent the morning outfitting Katherine for travel. Winston took her to the general store and helped her select practical clothing including split riding skirts, sturdy boots, a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun, and a warm coat for cold nights. She protested at the expense, but Winston remained firm. You said you would not be obligated to me, and I agreed to that. But I cannot in good conscience take you into the desert inadequately equipped. Consider this an investment in your safety, which is important to me. At the livery, they selected a gentle bay mare that the stable owner assured them was even-tempered and reliable. Katherine tentatively petted the horse's nose, and the mare nuzzled her hand in return. What will you call her? Winston asked. I have never named anything before, Katherine said wonderingly. It feels significant somehow. It is. The relationship between a rider and their horse is important. She will carry you safely if you treat her well. Katherine thought for a moment. Willow. She is graceful and gentle like a willow tree. By afternoon, they had assembled everything Katherine would need for the journey. Winston arranged for their departure the following morning, giving Katherine one more night to rest in a proper bed before they took to the trail. That evening, they took a walk around Bisbee as the sun began to set. Winston found himself explaining various things about the town's history and the surrounding landscape, and Katherine listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions. Have you spent much time in Tucson? She asked as they walked past the livery. Some. It is bigger than Bisbee, more established. Good mix of Mexican and American culture, which makes for interesting food and commerce. You should be able to find work there without too much difficulty, especially with your sewing skills. I hope so. I need to prove to myself that I can make my own way in the world. They stopped at the edge of town where the desert stretched out before them, painted in shades of orange and purple by the setting sun. Winston pointed toward the distant mountains. My cabin is up there, about 4 days' hard travel north and east. The Pinaleno Mountains. Good hunting, clear water, and quiet like you cannot find anywhere else. It sounds lonely. It was. But now when I think about going back, it feels different, like I will be missing something important. Katherine turned to look at him, and Winston was struck again by her beauty in the fading light. I will miss you too when we part in Tucson, but I think this is the right way to do this. Neither of us should rush into something as important as a life partnership. You are wise beyond your years, Winston said. I had to grow up quickly. Hardship can do that to a person. They walked back to the hotel as darkness fell, and Winston left Katherine at her door with a simple good night. He lay awake for a long time that night, thinking about the journey ahead and the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he had been a solitary mountain man with no plans beyond resupplying and returning to his cabin. Now he was preparing to escort a woman to Tucson, a woman who had somehow become important to him in an impossibly short time. The journey to Tucson began under clear skies, and with Katherine showing considerable nervousness about riding Willow. Winston spent the first few hours teaching her the basics of horsemanship, remaining patient as she learned how to sit properly in the saddle and communicate with the mare through reins and leg pressure. "You are doing well," he said encouragingly as they rode across the desert floor. "Willow likes you. How can you tell? Her ears are relaxed, and she is responding to your cues without resistance. A horse that does not like its rider will let you know." By midday, Katherine had gained some confidence, though Winston could tell she was already getting sore from the unaccustomed activity. They stopped to rest in the shade of a rocky outcropping, and Winston showed her how to check Willow's hooves for stones and how to ensure the saddle was not rubbing incorrectly. "There is a lot to know about horses," Katherine observed, accepting the canteen of water Winston offered her. "They are complex creatures with their own personalities and needs, but once you understand them, they become partners rather than just transportation." They traveled at an easy pace, covering perhaps 15 miles that first day. When the sun began to lower, Winston found them a campsite near a small creek bed where a trickle of water still flowed despite the dry season. He showed Katherine how to set up their camp, explaining each task as he performed it. "Fire is important in the desert," he said as he gathered dried mesquite wood. "Not just for warmth at night, but to keep animals at a distance and to signal your location if you get separated from your traveling party." Katherine watched attentively as he built the fire and got it going with just a few strikes of flint against steel. "You make it look easy. It becomes second nature after years of practice, but I will teach you. Everyone should know how to build a fire." They shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack that Winston prepared over the fire, and Katherine surprised him by pulling out a small bag of coffee she had purchased in Bisbee. "I thought you might appreciate this," she said. "I noticed you drink coffee whenever it is available." Winston felt that now familiar warmth in his chest. "That is very thoughtful. Thank you." As darkness fell and the fire crackled between them, Winston told Katherine about life in the mountains, the animals he encountered, the changing of seasons, the challenges of winter survival. She listened with genuine fascination, asking questions that showed she was truly trying to understand his world. "It sounds beautiful but demanding," she said. "Are you never lonely up there?" "I have been," Winston admitted, "especially in recent years. I think perhaps a person can only be fully alone for so long before they start to need human connection again." "Is that why you came to my aid? Because you were hungry for connection with someone?" "Partly. But also because it was the right thing to do, and because there was something about you specifically that called to me. I have passed many people in need over the years, Kate. I help when I can, but I have never paid off a stranger's debt or rearranged my life to ensure their safety. What I feel for you is particular, not just general human compassion." Katherine hugged her knees to her chest, staring into the fire. "I feel it too, this pull toward you that I do not fully understand. Part of me wonders if it is real or if I am just grateful for your help and confusing gratitude with something deeper." "Time will tell," Winston said. "That is why we are doing this slowly, taking time to know each other properly." "Tell me about your family," Katherine said. "You mentioned your father was cruel, but what about before that? Do you have any happy memories?" Winston was quiet for a moment, reaching back into a past he rarely visited. "My mother was kind. I remember her singing while she worked, and the way she would sneak me extra food when my father was not looking. She had red hair like copper and a smile that made you feel warm inside. She died when I was 8, and everything changed after that. My father became harder, angrier. He remarried within a year to a woman who saw me as a burden rather than a child to be raised. I am sorry. Children deserve better than that. They do. What about your parents? Catherine's expression softened. My mother was beautiful and talented. She could make the most stunning dresses from scraps of fabric that other seamstresses would throw away. She taught me that work was not just about earning money, but about taking pride in creating something well-made and lovely. My father was a quiet man who loved her deeply. When she died, something in him broke. He started drinking and gambling, trying to fill the hole she left behind. The debts accumulated quickly after that. You must have felt very alone. I did. I went from having 2 loving parents to having one broken one to having no one at all in the space of 2 years. Mrs. Henderson seemed like a solution at first, someone who would take care of me in exchange for work. I did not realize until it was too late that she saw me as property to be exploited. You are free of her now, Winston reminded her gently. Thanks to you. I still cannot quite believe it. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching sparks from the fire dance up toward the star-filled sky. Eventually, Winston banked the fire and showed Katherine how to arrange her bedroll for maximum comfort and warmth. We will take turns keeping watch, he said. I will take the first shift. You should sleep. Keeping watch for what? Animals mostly. Coyotes, maybe a mountain lion if we are unlucky. Also, other travelers are not always friendly. It is better to be cautious. Katherine looked around at the dark desert surrounding their small circle of firelight. This is a very different world than living in town. It is. But you will adapt. You are stronger than you think, Kate. She settled into her bedroll, and Winston positioned himself where he could watch both the camp and Katherine. He listened as her breathing gradually evened out into sleep, then turned his attention to the night sounds around them. The distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the whisper of wind across the desert. He thought about what Kate had said, about wondering if her feelings were real or just gratitude. Winston understood the concern, but he also trusted what he felt. This was not simple attraction or loneliness seeking any port in a storm. This was something specific and powerful, a recognition of someone who could be a true partner in life. But she needed time to discover that for herself, and he would give her that time, even if it was difficult. The next 3 days fell into a rhythm. They rose with the sun, traveled until midday heat made it prudent to rest, then continued in the afternoon until sunset. Winston used the time to teach Katherine practical skills: how to read the land for water sources, how to identify edible plants, how to move quietly through terrain. She proved an apt student, quick to learn and unafraid to ask questions. At night, they talked. Winston found himself sharing stories he had told no one, about close calls with bears, about winters that nearly killed him, about the strange peace that came from being alone with one's thoughts for months at a time. Katherine reciprocated with her own stories. Happy memories of her mother's laughter, the satisfaction of completing a particularly beautiful dress, dreams she had harbored before her father's death had changed everything. I used to imagine having a shop on a main street in a big city, she said one night. Large windows where I could display the dresses, and a workshop in the back where I could create without anyone standing over me, criticizing every stitch. Women would come to me because they knew I would make them something beautiful and unique, not just copy whatever was in the fashion magazines. You can still have that, Winston said. It will take time and money, but if you work toward it steadily, there is no reason you cannot build that dream. Even if I decide to live in the mountains with a certain mountain man, Winston's heart skipped. Would you consider that? I thought you wanted city life. I thought I did too. But the more you describe your life up there, the more I wonder if what I really wanted was not the city itself, but the freedom and peace of mind that I thought only the city could provide. Perhaps those things exist in the mountains as well. They do, Winston said carefully. But Kate, mountain life is hard, especially in winter. I would not want you to give up your dreams only to find yourself miserable and trapped again, even if the trapper this time is well-meaning. I appreciate that you think about such things, but let me worry about my own decisions. For now, I just want you to know that I am open to all possibilities. My mind is not set on any particular future except one where I am free to make my own choices and, hopefully, spending time with you. They reached Tucson on the afternoon of the 5th day. The city was larger than Bisbee, with a pleasant mix of adobe buildings and newer wooden structures. The streets were busy with commerce. Merchants selling goods, wagons hauling supplies, people of various backgrounds going about their business. Winston guided them to a respectable boarding house he knew from previous visits, run by a widow named Mrs. Santos, who kept clean rooms and asked few questions. He helped Katherine secure a room and carried her bags inside while she looked around with interest. "It is nice," she said, running her hand over the simple but well-made furniture. "Much nicer than Mrs. Henderson's establishment. Mrs. Santos is a fair woman. She charges reasonable rates and treats her boarders with respect." They had agreed that Winston would stay for a few days to help Katherine get settled and find employment before heading back to his mountains. He used his contacts in town to introduce her to several shop owners who might need a skilled seamstress. And by the end of the 2nd day, Katherine had secured a position at a dress shop owned by a kind Mexican woman named Señora Martinez. "She saw my work and hired me on the spot," Katherine said excitedly when she met Winston for dinner that evening. "The pay is fair, and she said if I prove myself, she might even consider a partnership arrangement in the future." "That is wonderful," Winston said, genuinely happy for her success while simultaneously feeling the weight of their approaching separation. "When do you need to leave?" Katherine asked, her expression turning more somber. "Tomorrow or the day after. I need to get back before the weather turns. Winter comes early in the high country and I have preparations to make." Katherine nodded, but Winston saw the sadness in her eyes. "I understand. You have already given me so much time and I am grateful. We agreed to write letters, yes?" "Yes. I come down from the mountains every few months for supplies. I will check with the post office in Bisbee for letters from you, and I will write back as I am able. Will you come to Tucson sometimes instead of Bisbee?" "I can. It is not much farther and it has better suppliers anyway." They finished their meal and walked through the streets of Tucson as the sun set. Winston found himself memorizing details. The way Katherine's face lit up when she saw something interesting, the sound of her laugh when a dog ran past chasing a rolling ball, the feeling of her hand tucked into the crook of his arm as they walked. "I am going to miss you," Katherine said as they made their way back to the boarding house. "These past days have been some of the happiest of my life, despite the soreness from riding." Winston smiled. "You will be even more sore tomorrow, now that you are not riding every day." A small price to pay for freedom and good company. They stopped outside the boarding house, and Winston knew this was goodbye, at least for a while. He took both of Katherine's hands in his, dwarfing her smaller ones with his calloused fingers. "You take care of yourself, Kate. Work hard, save your money, and figure out what you want from life. I will be here whenever you write, and I will come see you whenever I can. But there is no pressure, no obligation. Your life is your own now." Katherine looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, Winston, for everything. You gave me back my life, and I will never forget that. But more than that, you gave me hope that good men exist in this world, men who see women as people rather than property or conveniences. Whatever happens between us, I want you to know that you changed my life in ways that go far beyond paying off a debt." Winston felt his throat tighten with emotion. Acting on impulse, he bent down and pressed a gentle kiss to Katherine's forehead, breathing in the scent of her hair. "You changed my life too, Kate. The mountains will feel different now, knowing you are out here in the world." She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, her hand resting briefly against his chest. "Be safe up there, and come back to me when you can." "I will. That is a promise." Winston forced himself to step back, to release her hands, to turn and walk away before the temptation to stay became overwhelming. He did not look back, knowing that seeing her face would make leaving even harder. The next morning, Winston loaded his supplies onto Ranger and headed out of Tucson toward the mountains. The journey that had seemed to pass so quickly with Katherine beside him now felt endless and lonely. He had made this trip dozens of times over the years, but this was the first time it felt like he was leaving something important behind. The weeks that followed fell into Winston's familiar pattern. He hunted and trapped, laid in supplies for winter, repaired his cabin and made improvements that had needed doing for years. But everything felt different now. He found himself talking out loud more, explaining things to Katherine as though she were there, imagining how she would respond to various situations. He also found himself working on a letter, composing lines in his head during the day and writing them down at night by firelight. It was harder than he had expected, translating his feelings and experiences into words on paper. But he persisted, wanting Kate to know that he was thinking of her and that their time together had not been forgotten. 3 months after leaving Tucson, Winston made the journey to Bisbee for supplies and to check for letters. His heart pounded as he entered the post office, and the clerk handed him 3 envelopes addressed in Katherine's neat handwriting. Winston paid for postage for his own letter to Katherine, then found a quiet spot outside town to read her words. The first letter was dated just 2 weeks after their separation. Katherine described settling into her new job, the kindness of Senora Martinez, the small room she had rented at the boarding house. She wrote about Tucson's markets and the interesting mix of cultures, about the dress designs she was working on, about how much she missed their evening conversations. The second letter, written a month later, was longer. Katherine had received a small raise after proving her skill, and she was saving diligently toward her dream of a shop. She had made friends with some of the other workers, and had even attended a social dance, though she assured Winston she had not danced with anyone but had simply enjoyed the music and atmosphere. She asked him questions about winter in the mountains, and whether he was staying warm and safe. The third letter was the most recent, just a week old. Katherine wrote that she had been thinking a great deal about what she wanted from life. While she was grateful for her job and the opportunities Tucson offered, she found herself increasingly drawn to the idea of a simpler, quieter life. She had been researching what would be involved in living in a remote area, and had even been practicing camping skills with some Mexican women she had befriended who knew about surviving in harsh conditions. "I am not saying I have made any final decisions," she wrote, "but I wanted you to know that my heart seems to have its own ideas about my future, and those ideas involve you and your mountains more than they involve city life and a dress shop. I miss you terribly, Winston. Your letter has not yet arrived, but I hope it comes soon. I need to know that you are well and that you think of me as often as I think of you." Winston read the letters 3 times, then carefully folded them and placed them in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. He spent that night in Bisbee, but his mind was already racing ahead, planning. By the time spring arrived, Winston had made several more trips to Bisbee to exchange letters with Katherine. Each exchange deepened his certainty that what he felt for her was real and lasting, not just loneliness or temporary infatuation. Katherine's letters revealed a woman who was genuinely considering a life in the mountains, who asked practical questions about what that would entail and seemed to be making concrete preparations. In March, Winston made a decision. Instead of heading to Bisbee, he turned ranger toward Tucson. It was time to see Katherine again, to determine if the connection they felt through letters translated to the same pull they had experienced during their journey together. He arrived in Tucson on a warm afternoon and went directly to the boarding house. Mrs. Santos greeted him with a knowing smile. "Mr. Jenkins, how good to see you again. I believe you are here to see Miss Vaughn, if she is available. She is at work at Senora Martinez's shop, 3 blocks down on the right. You cannot miss it." Winston thanked her and made his way to the dress shop. Through the large front window, he could see Katherine working at a table in the back, her head bent over fabric, her hands moving with practiced skill. For a moment, he just watched her, noting how she had changed in the months since he had last seen her. She looked healthy and happy, more filled out than she had been when working for Mrs. Henderson, her face peaceful with concentration. Winston entered the shop, and a small bell over the door announced his presence. Katherine looked up, and for a moment, her expression was blank with surprise. Then recognition dawned, followed by joy that transformed her entire face. "Winston." She was around the table and crossing the shop before he could respond, launching herself into his arms with an abandon that made his heart soar. Winston caught her easily, lifting her off her feet as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Hello, Kate," he said, his face buried in her hair. "I missed you." "I missed you too. Why did you not write that you were coming? I would have prepared, would have arranged time away from work." "I wanted to surprise you. And I wanted to see you as you really are in your life here, not dressed up for a visit." Katherine pulled back enough to look at him, her hands framing his bearded face. "You grew your beard longer. Winter was cold. It helped." She laughed, and the sound filled him with warmth. "I am so happy you are here. When did you arrive? How long can you stay?" "I arrived just now, and I can stay as long as you want me to." A discreet cough reminded them they were not alone. Senora Martinez stood near the back of the shop, her expression amused. "So this is the famous Winston that I have heard so much about." Katherine blushed, but did not step out of Winston's embrace. "Senora Martinez, this is Winston Jenkins." "Winston, this is my employer and friend, Senora Martinez." "A pleasure to meet you, Senora," Winston said politely, "and you, Mr. Jenkins. Katherine speaks of you often. It is clear you are important to each other." She waved her hand. "Go, go. Take the rest of the day. We are not busy, and matters of the heart should not be delayed." "But, Senora, I have work to complete, which will still be here tomorrow." "Go, Mija. Enjoy your reunion." Katherine hugged her employer quickly, then grabbed her shawl from a hook and took Winston's hand. "Come on before she changes her mind." They walked through Tucson together, hands clasped, talking rapidly as they tried to catch up on everything the letters had not covered. Winston told her about winter in the mountains, about the heavy snows and the elk he had hunted, about the new bookshelf he had built in his cabin, thinking of the day she might need it for her belongings. Katherine told him about learning Spanish from Senora Martinez and the other workers, about the complex dresses she had created for some of Tucson's wealthier residents, about the money she had saved, and the growing certainty in her heart about what she wanted. They found themselves at the edge of town where the desert stretched out before them, familiar and vast. Winston turned to face Katherine, taking both her hands in his. "Kate, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly without consideration for my feelings." "All right," she said, her expression turning serious. "Are you truly interested in a life in the mountains? Or is it me you are interested in and you are willing to endure the mountains to be with me? Because those are two different things, and one will lead to happiness while the other will eventually lead to resentment." Katherine was quiet for a moment, and Winston appreciated that she was giving his question real thought rather than answering impulsively. "I think it is both," she finally said. "I am interested in you, yes. I think I might even love you, though that feels like a big word to use after being apart for so long. But it is also more than that. I have spent these months in Tucson building exactly the life I thought I wanted. Good work, fair pay, friends, the prospect of someday owning my own shop. And while I am grateful for all of it, I find myself feeling hollow inside, like I am going through motions rather than truly living. When I think about the life you described, about the mountains and the seasons and the simplicity of it, something in my soul responds. I think I want both, you and the life you lead, but I will not know for certain until I try it." "That is fair," Winston said. "What if we did this? You come back with me to the mountains. Not permanently, but for a few months. See what it is really like, experience a full season cycle. If you find that you love it and want to stay, then we talk about making that permanent. If you find that you hate it, then you come back to Tucson with no hard feelings and we remain friends who care about each other but have incompatible lives. And if I fall somewhere in between, if I like parts of it but find other parts too difficult, then we negotiate. Maybe we find a way for you to spend part of the year in the mountains and part in town. Maybe we build a compromise life that incorporates elements of both, but we figure it out together as partners." Katherine squeezed his hands. "You would really do that? Compromise your mountain solitude for part of the year? Kate, I have learned something important these past months. Solitude is only valuable when you choose it, not when it is forced upon you by circumstance or stubbornness. I choose you over solitude. If that means spending more time in civilization, then so be it. You are worth any compromise." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I think we found each other," Winston corrected gently. "And I think we should stop wasting time being apart when we could be together." Katherine stood on her toes and kissed him, her hands sliding into his hair. Winston wrapped his arms around her waist and lifted her off her feet, kissing her back with all the longing and love that had built up over their months of separation. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I need to give Senora Martinez proper notice," Katherine said. "I cannot just leave her without help." "Of course. How much time do you need?" 2 weeks should be sufficient for her to find a replacement or redistribute the work. "And I will need to settle my affairs at the boarding house and purchase supplies for the journey." "We will do it together," Winston said. "I am not going anywhere without you again." The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity and anticipation. Winston helped Katherine prepare for mountain life, purchasing warmer clothing and durable supplies. Senora Martinez was sad to see Katherine go but wished her well, and even gifted her several bolts of fabric and a fine sewing kit. "For when you want to make beautiful things in your new home," the older woman said, embracing Katherine warmly. "And you must write to me. Tell me all about this mountain life. Maybe I am too old for such adventure, but I can enjoy it through your letters." Mrs. Santos also bid Katherine a fond farewell, accepting the notice with grace and making Katherine promise to visit if she ever came back to Tucson. Finally, the morning of departure arrived. Winston loaded their supplies onto Ranger and the pack mule he had purchased, while Katherine said final goodbyes to the friends she had made. They rode out of Tucson, heading northeast toward the Pinaleno Mountains, and Winston felt a completeness settle over him that he had not known he was missing. The journey took 6 days, and Winston used the time to continue teaching Katherine survival skills. She was an eager student, asking questions and practicing techniques until she felt confident. At night, they shared a bedroll for warmth, and Winston held Katherine close, marveling at how natural it felt to have her beside him. When they finally reached Winston's cabin, tucked into a pine-covered mountainside with a clear stream running nearby, Katherine dismounted and stood looking at it with wonder. "It is beautiful," she said. "I was expecting something much more primitive. I have lived here for 15 years. I have made improvements over time." Winston showed her around the sturdy log structure. One large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A separate bedroom he had added a few years prior. A stone fireplace that heated the whole cabin efficiently, and various touches of comfort he had added over the years. "You have books," Katherine said with delight, running her fingers over the spines on the shelf he had built. "I read when I'm snowed in during winter. Helps pass the long nights. And you have windows with real glass and a table with chairs, and is that a bathing tub?" "I am a mountain man, not a barbarian," Winston said with amusement. "I like comfort as much as anyone." Katherine turned to him, her expression full of joy. "Winston, this is wonderful. I thought I would be living in a primitive shack, but this is actually a home." "It is my home," Winston said. "And if you choose to stay, it will be our home. But first, let me show you the rest." He took her outside and showed her the cold cellar where he stored food, the smokehouse for preserving meat, the small stable he had built for the horses, and the various other structures and systems he had developed over the years to make mountain living sustainable. "You are completely self-sufficient up here," Katherine observed. "I have to be. The nearest town is 4 days away, and in winter I can be snowed in for weeks at a time. Everything I need, I either have on hand or can make or hunt for." The first few weeks were an adjustment for Katherine, but she adapted more quickly than Winston had dared hope. She learned to help with hunting and trapping, how to preserve meat and forage for edible plants, how to chop wood and maintain the fire. She also brought her own skills to their life, sewing new clothes and curtains, reorganizing the cabin's interior to be more efficient, cooking meals that were considerably better than Winston's usual fare. At night, they would sit by the fire, and Winston would teach Katherine to read the weather and the animals, while she would tell him stories or read aloud from his books. They fell into a partnership that felt both natural and precious, each contributing their strengths to create something better than either could have built alone. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Katherine turned to Winston with a serious expression. "I have something to tell you," she said. Winston felt his stomach tighten. "What is it?" "I have been here for 2 months now. I have experienced the last of winter and the beginning of spring. I have seen your life and participated in it, and I need you to know that I want to stay. Not as a trial, not as an experiment, but permanently. This is where I want to build my life, Winston. With you." Relief and joy flooded through Winston. "Are you certain? You do not need more time to be sure." "I am certain. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Winston Jenkins. I love your strength and your kindness, your patience and your wisdom. I love this life you have built and the man you have become. I want to share all of it with you, for as long as we both live." Winston pulled Katherine into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "I love you too, Kate. I think I have loved you since that first night when I found you mending by moonlight, determined and strong despite everything that had been done to you. You are the bravest person I have ever met, and I am honored that you choose to share your life with me." They kissed as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Winston felt a peace settle over him that he had never known before. He had found his partner, the person who made his life complete, and she had found her freedom and her home in his arms. That summer, Winston and Katherine made the journey to the nearest town with a proper church, and were married by a traveling preacher in a simple ceremony with only a few strangers as witnesses. Katherine wore a dress she had made herself from the fabric Senora Martinez had given her, and Winston wore his best clothes, his hair neatly tied back and his beard trimmed. They spent their wedding night in a hotel room, and Winston was gentle and patient as they came together for the first time, Katherine trusting him with her vulnerability and her love. Afterward, she lay in his arms and told him she had never imagined such happiness was possible. "I was so certain life would always be hard, that I would always have to fight just to survive," she said softly. "But you have given me a life where I can thrive, where I am valued and loved and free to be myself." "You gave that to yourself," Winston corrected. "I just helped clear the obstacles. Your strength and determination made this life possible." They returned to the mountain cabin and settled into a rhythm that would define their life together. Winston hunted and trapped, while Katherine managed their home and continued her sewing work, now making clothes for the occasional trapper or miner who would hear about her skills and make the journey to commission her work. She earned enough to satisfy her need for independence, while still having plenty of time to help Winston with the countless tasks required to maintain their mountain homestead. As the years passed, their love deepened and matured. They learned each other's moods and rhythms, how to navigate disagreements with respect and compromise, how to support each other through difficult times, and celebrate the good ones together. 2 years into their marriage, Katherine gave birth to a son they named William, after Winston's late mother's maiden name. The boy was healthy and strong, with his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes. Winston had been terrified during Katherine's pregnancy and labor, acutely aware of how far they were from medical help. But Katherine had been strong throughout and delivered their son with the help of a midwife they had brought to the cabin, a month before the baby was due. Watching Katherine with their son, seeing her sing lullabies and cradle him against her chest, Winston fell in love with her all over again. She was a natural mother, patient and nurturing while still maintaining the strength and independence he so admired. When William was 3 years old, Katherine became pregnant again and delivered a daughter they named Emma. The little girl had her mother's features but her father's stubborn determination, and she grew into a bright, curious child who followed Winston everywhere, wanting to learn everything about the mountains and the animals that lived there. Their life was not without challenges. There were hard winters when supplies ran low, illnesses that frightened them both, the constant physical demands of mountain living, and the isolation that sometimes weighed heavy even on those who had chosen it. But through everything, Winston and Katherine faced difficulties as a team, supporting and strengthening each other. Katherine never lost her love of sewing and design. She created beautiful clothes for herself and the children, and her commission work became so sought after that she had to turn down requests due to lack of time. She also taught both William and Emma to sew, believing that all people should have practical skills regardless of gender. Winston taught the children about the mountains, how to read tracks and sign, how to move quietly through the forest, how to respect the land and the animals that called it home. He also made sure they learned to read and write, using his small library and Catherine's teaching skills to ensure their children would have choices in life beyond what the mountains offered. When William turned 15, he expressed interest in seeing more of the world beyond the mountains. Winston and Katherine supported his choice, helping him secure an apprenticeship with a carpenter in Tucson. It was hard to watch their son leave, but they knew he needed to find his own path, just as they both had. Emma, however, never wavered in her love of mountain life. She became a skilled hunter and tracker, and at 16, she could outshoot most men and navigate the high country with confidence. She eventually married a young trapper named Thomas, who treated her as an equal partner, and they built their own cabin a few miles from Winston and Catherine's place, close enough to help in emergencies, but far enough for independence. As Winston and Katherine grew older, they spent more time sitting on their porch watching the seasons change, reflecting on the life they had built together. William visited when he could, bringing his own wife and children to meet the grandparents who lived in the mountains. Emma and Thomas were frequent visitors, often bringing fresh game or simply stopping by to share a meal and conversation. On the evening of their 30th wedding anniversary, Winston and Katherine sat together watching the sunset, just as they had countless times before. Katherine's hair was now streaked with silver, and Winston's beard was more gray than dark, but the love between them remained as strong as ever. "You ever regret it?" Winston asked, his arm around Katherine's shoulders. "Choosing this life instead of the dress shop and city living?" Katherine looked at him with surprise. "Not for a single moment. Do you regret taking in that woman you found mending by moonlight all those years ago?" "It was the best decision I ever made," Winston said firmly. "You gave my life meaning, Kate. Before you, I was just surviving. With you, I have truly lived." "We built something good together," Katherine said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Something that will outlast us and our children and the life we created." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the sounds of the mountain evening surrounding them. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through pine trees, the distant call of a coyote. Winston thought about that night 32 years ago when he had first seen Katherine sitting alone in inadequate moonlight, struggling to complete her work despite impossible circumstances. He had brought her candles and sat beside her quietly, a simple gesture that had changed both their lives forever. From that small act of kindness had grown a love story that had weathered decades and would continue in their children and grandchildren. It was more than Winston had ever imagined for himself, more than he had known to hope for during his long years of solitude. Katherine squeezed his hand, and Winston knew without words that she was thinking similar thoughts, reflecting on the unlikely journey that had brought them together and the life they had built in these mountains. They had both been searching for freedom when they met, Winston from his painful past, Katherine from her forced servitude. What they had found instead was something more valuable, the freedom that came from choosing to commit to another person, from building a life based on mutual respect and love. As the stars emerged overhead, brilliant in the clear mountain air, Winston pulled Katherine closer and kissed the top of her head. They would face whatever years remained to them together, partners to the end, their love a quiet testament to the power of simple kindness and the courage to reach for something better. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of wild flowers and pine sap, and Winston felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful in its intensity. He had found his home not in a place but in a person, and that home had given him everything that mattered: love, family, purpose and peace. Katherine looked up at him, her eyes reflecting starlight, and smiled the same smile that had captivated him decades ago. Some things, Winston thought, never changed, and some loves were truly built to last a lifetime and beyond. They had found that love by moonlight and candlelight, and they would carry it forward until their final days, a gift they had given each other, and would pass on to future generations as proof that hope and love could triumph over even the hardest circumstances. The night deepened around them, but inside their cabin, lights glowed warm and welcoming, a beacon of home and happiness in the vast wilderness. And in the morning, they would rise together and face another day of their shared life, grateful for what they had found and built together. Two people who had saved each other and created something beautiful in the process. Winston had stopped being a solitary mountain man the night he chose to sit beside Katherine in companionable silence while she mended by candlelight. In that choice, he had found his future, his family, and his forever. And Katherine, who had been seeking freedom from bondage, had found something even more precious, a partnership built on equality, respect, and enduring love. Together, they had created a legacy that would echo through the mountains for generations to come, a story of love that began with simple kindness and grew into something extraordinary. Their story was complete, their circle closed, their love proven through decades of shared joys and hardships. And as they finally retired inside for the evening, hands clasped together as they had been countless times before, both knew with absolute certainty that they had found what every heart seeks, a true and lasting home in another person's love.